The Idaho student murders. It was a cold November night in 2022. Moscow, Idaho, a small, quiet college town, was settling into another weekend. Students were out at bars, celebrating, laughing, completely unaware that something unthinkable was about to happen. Inside a 3-story house on King Road, for students, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were wrapping up their night. Friends since childhood, Kaylee and Madison were inseparable, sharing dreams, secrets, and a bond that felt unbreakable. Xana and Ethan, a young couple full of life, had spent the evening together, unaware that it would be their last. What happened next remains one of the most horrifying and mysterious crimes in recent history. Sometime between 4 o'clock and 4:30 a.m., a brutal killer entered their home, moving room by room in the darkness. No one heard screams loud enough to wake the neighbors. No desperate calls for help. Just silence, followed by the unimaginable. By morning, the world had changed. For lives were stolen in a manner so savage, so chilling, that seasoned investigators were left shaken. Yet, for hours, no call to 911 was made. For hours, their bodies remained undiscovered inside the house while the town carried on, oblivious. And then, the questions began. How did the killer enter so easily? Why was there no forced entry? Why did some roommates survive while others didn't? And most importantly, why did it take weeks before police identified a suspect? Then came the arrest. A name, Bryan Kohberger, a criminology PhD student, a man who by all accounts had been studying how to commit the perfect crime. But the deeper we look, the more unsettling this case becomes. The timeline, the evidence, the investigations. There are gaps, inconsistencies, pieces of the puzzle that don't fit. Some believe Kohberger acted alone. Others? They aren't so sure. For years, the truth has been hidden. Now, it's time to uncover what really happened that night. The mistakes, the secrets, and the shocking details that still don't add up. Because everything you think you know about the Idaho murders, it's only half the story. And the truth, maybe even darker than we ever imagined. The chilling night, November 13th, 2022. A night like any other in Moscow, Idaho. A small college town where life moved at a steady, peaceful pace. On the southeastern edge of town sat a 3-story house on 1122, King Road, a home that had seen countless parties, late-night study sessions, and the everyday joys of college life. Inside, 6 University of Idaho students shared the space. It was nothing out of the ordinary. Just another home filled with laughter, friendships, and the fleeting innocence of youth. But that house would soon become something else. A crime scene, a place of horror, a silent witness to a massacre. A house like any other, until it wasn't. The King Road house stood on a slight hill, overlooking the town. It was tucked into a neighborhood where students lived, studied, and partied without much concern for the outside world. A white, slightly weathered house with a deck, large windows, and an eerie sense of isolation. The layout of the house was strange. The bottom floor, partially underground, had 2 bedrooms, one of which was unoccupied that night. The second floor, where Xana Kernodle and her boyfriend Ethan Chapin stayed, opened to the kitchen and living room. The third floor belonged to best friends Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen, 2 girls who had grown up together, practically inseparable. To outsiders, this house was just another rental property for students. But to those inside, it was home, a place where they should have been safe. Until the night of November 13th. The victims, for lives cut short. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen had been best friends since childhood. They had grown up together, shared dreams, made plans for the future. Kaylee was planning to move to Texas soon, ready to take on a new chapter in her life. Madison, always the life of the party, had a bright, infectious energy that drew people to her. That night, they had gone out to a local bar, the Corner Club, a place they had visited many times before. Just 2 girls enjoying a Saturday night out, laughing, drinking, making memories. Hours later, they grabbed a quick bite from a local food truck, appearing carefree, unaware that this would be their final meal. Back at the King Road house, Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin, a couple deeply in love, had also spent the evening together. Xana was known for her sharp wit and sarcasm, while Ethan, one of a set of triplets, had an easygoing personality that made everyone love him. That night, they returned home, likely expecting nothing more than a quiet night in. But by morning, they would all be gone. The unthinkable happens. At around 4 a.m., something unimaginable took place inside that house. A shadow moved in the darkness. A figure entered unnoticed, unheard. A silent predator in the night. Whoever it was, they knew the house. They moved quickly, efficiently. The attacks were brutal. A sharp weapon, a stealthy execution. No forced entry. No shattered windows. No signs of struggle that echoed beyond those walls. For young lives were taken within minutes. And yet, for hours, the world outside remained oblivious. The discovery of the bodies. The next morning, the town of Moscow woke up just like any other day. Students went to brunch, friends sent texts, life moved on. Inside the King Road house, however, something was wrong. Two surviving roommates, who had been asleep on the bottom floor, began to realize something was off. One of them, a young woman, claimed she had seen a masked figure walking past her in the night. She had frozen, terrified, locking herself in her room. The details remain unclear. Why she didn't call the police immediately. Why the house stayed silent for so long. But what we do know is this. At 11:58 a.m., a 911 call was finally made. A voice on the other end, distressed, asking for help. The call was made from inside the house, reporting an unconscious person. But what the police found when they arrived was far worse than anything they had imagined. Blood. So much blood. The scene was described as one of the most gruesome they had ever witnessed. Kaylee and Madison were found together in the same bed, as if they had sought comfort in their final moments. Xana and Ethan, both discovered on the second floor, had fought desperately for their lives. The details were horrifying. The injuries were beyond brutal. And yet, there were no signs of forced entry. The reality of what had happened sent shockwaves through the town. For students, gone in a single night. A crime so senseless, so savage, that no one could understand why. The media frenzy begins. Within hours, the news had spread. For University of Idaho students found dead in off-campus house. The first headlines broke, igniting a wildfire of speculation. News trucks arrived. Reporters swarmed the scene. The town, once known for its peace and quiet, had become the center of a national nightmare. Theories emerged. Some whispered that it was a crime of passion. Others speculated about a serial killer on the loose. Why had no one heard the attacks? Why were two roommates left unharmed? And most chilling of all, how had the killer slipped away? Completely undetected? The police had no answers. No suspect. No motive. Only a single, undeniable truth. A killer had walked into that house that night. And then, just as easily, they had walked out. But who were they? And how had they managed to disappear without a trace? These were the questions that haunted the families, the friends, and an entire nation. But the search for truth was only just beginning. And soon, the world would learn that this case was far more complex than anyone could have imagined. The police's biggest mistakes. When the first officers arrived at 1122 King Road, they had no idea what they were walking into. A quiet college home, standing in the daylight, looked like any other. But inside was something out of a nightmare. Blood pooled across floors. Walls bore the silent evidence of what had taken place. The bodies of 4 young students, each lifeless, left behind in a crime so brutal that even experienced officers struggled to process what they were seeing. Yet, from the very beginning, the case was mishandled. A delayed response, the hours that were lost. The 911 call was made at 11:58 a.m., nearly 8 hours after the attacks likely occurred. 8 hours! An eternity in an investigation like this. When police first arrived, they didn't immediately recognize this as a murder scene. The 911 call had described an unconscious person, so officers weren't expecting what they found. They didn't treat it like an active crime scene, at least not right away. First responders walked in and out of the house without protective gear. Contamination. One of the worst things that can happen to a crime scene. Key evidence may have been lost. Footprints. DNA traces, hair fibers, anything that could have pointed to the killer. Some officers even assumed at first that this was an overdose case, a tragic but common college town incident. But as they moved through the house, reality set in for victims. Stab wounds. No signs of forced entry. This was no overdose. No suspect for weeks. Was a killer hiding in plain sight? As word spread, Moscow, Idaho, went from a peaceful college town to a place gripped by fear. Parents pulled their children out of the university. Students refused to leave their dorms. Professors canceled classes. A killer was out there, and no one knew who it was. Days passed, then weeks. And the police? They had no suspect. The FBI was called in. State police arrived. But there was no clear direction. At press conferences, officials seemed confused. They contradicted themselves. One moment, they said the town was safe. The next, they warned everyone to stay inside. At one point, a lead investigator even suggested the murders were targeted, only to backtrack later, saying they weren't sure. Was it targeted? Or was this a random killer on the loose? No one seemed to have answers. Misinformation everywhere. Social media detectives take over. In the absence of real answers, the internet stepped in. Reddit, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube. Everyone became an investigator overnight. Some of the theories were harmless. People dissected news reports, looked for inconsistencies, and tried to piece together clues. Others? They ruined lives. One professor was accused of being the killer. Her name dragged to the mud, her career nearly destroyed. She wasn't involved. A food truck worker seen on camera the night of the murders was harassed online. People demanded police arrest him, even though there was no evidence. The two surviving roommates? They were victims too, but the internet decided they were hiding something. People asked, why didn't they call 911 sooner? Why did one of them see a masked man but not scream? The reality? Survivor's paralysis is real. Fear is unpredictable. And yet, the rumors didn't stop. Even the police weren't safe from scrutiny. Body cam footage from that night. The strange stops near the crime scene. Weeks later, body cam footage surfaced from the same night as the murders. At 3:12 a.m., police officers pulled over 3 young men just a short distance from the King Road house. The reason? Underage drinking. The men looked nervous, uneasy. But here's where things got strange. The officers let them go with just a warning. The footage never showed their faces clearly. The police never followed up publicly. Could this be connected? Was it coincidence? Or did the police let a suspect slip through their fingers that night? And then another revelation. At 2:50 a.m., not far from the King Road house, a security camera picked up a white Hyundai Elantra driving by. It would take police nearly a month to announce they were looking for a car matching that description. A month, 30 days where a potential suspect had time to cover their tracks. Had the killer been in that car? Had they driven away unnoticed while the town slept? One thing was becoming painfully clear. This investigation was full of mischances. Evidence was lost. Mistakes were made. The killer had vanished into thin air. And for weeks, the world was left with only one terrifying truth. The person responsible for the Idaho student murders was still out there, and no one knew where they were. The chilling suspect. For weeks, the town of Moscow, Idaho, lived in fear. A killer had walked into a house in the dead of night. Students were slaughtered, and yet the person responsible had disappeared without a trace. Then, almost 7 weeks later, a name surfaced. Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old criminology PhD student from Washington State University, just 10 miles away from the crime scene. At first glance, he seemed ordinary, a quiet, intelligent student with a fascination for criminal psychology. But when investigators started digging deeper, what they found was disturbing. Who is Bryan Kohberger? A criminology student obsessed with murder cases. Kohberger had spent years studying the minds of killers. At DeSales University, he earned a degree in psychology and later a master's in criminal justice. His professor described him as intelligent, focused, but also intensely analytical. One professor said he was obsessed with understanding what drove people to kill. And then there was something even more unsettling. The eerie Reddit posts. A disturbing experiment? Months before the Idaho murders, a Reddit post appeared under the username criminology_student. It was a survey, but not just any survey. It asked criminals to describe their thoughts and emotions while committing a crime. The post read, "How did you approach your target? What were you thinking before you made your move? What did you feel after? Did you struggle with emotions or remain detached?" It was phrased like a psychological experiment, but looking back, it felt like something much darker. Was Kohberger trying to understand killers, or preparing to become one? The bizarre drive home to Pennsylvania. Was the FBI watching? After the murders, Kohberger didn't stay in Moscow. Instead, he and his father drove over 2,500 miles across the country to Pennsylvania, where his family lived. This wasn't a normal road trip. Twice, Kohberger was pulled over by police in Indiana for tailgating. But strangely, he wasn't arrested. Dashcam footage later showed him acting calm, almost too calm. At one point, his father casually mentioned a mass shooting in Moscow, as if trying to gauge his son's reaction. What neither of them knew was that FBI agents were already tracking them. By then, investigators had zeroed in on a white Hyundai Elantra, the same car seen near the crime scene the night of the murders. Kohberger owned one, and DNA evidence was closing in on him. Why did Kohberger choose these victims? A random killing or a targeted attack? This is the question that still haunts everyone. Was this random? Or had Kohberger been watching them for weeks? Maybe even months? The house itself was well known to students. People came and went. Parties were held. Investigators later found that Kohberger's cell phone had pinged near the house at least 12 times before the murders. And then, a chilling revelation. Before the attack, someone searched online for Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen. Was it Kohberger? Had he been stalking them? Friends later said that Kaylee had told people she felt like she was being watched. Did she know, deep down, that someone was following her? Was there an accomplice? The shocking theories. Even after Kohberger was arrested, some things didn't add up. If Kohberger was so intelligent, why did he make so many mistakes? He left DNA on a knife sheath at the crime scene. He drove his own car near the house. He kept his phone on during suspicious times. Was this sloppiness or something else? And then, a chilling theory surfaced. What if he wasn't alone? Some believe there was an accomplice, someone who helped him plan, or even execute the attack. But if that's true, where is that person now? And what other secrets are still hidden in this case? The DNA bombshell. For weeks, the Idaho student murders have been a mystery, an unsolved horror story that left a quiet college town in shock. No fingerprints, no clear eyewitnesses, no murder weapon. But then, a single mistake changed everything. A piece of evidence left behind at the crime scene. So small, so simple, yet powerful enough to bring a suspect into the spotlight. It was a knife sheath. The knife sheath, the clue that changed everything. In the chaos of the crime scene, among the blood and broken lives, police found a military-style knife sheath. It was tan-colored. It was lying next to the victims' bodies, and it had a single trace of DNA on the button snap. That one tiny speck of DNA was all investigators needed. But the real twist? It didn't match Kohberger immediately. Instead, detectives ran it through a genealogy database, and what they found was chilling. The DNA matched Kohberger's father. This meant one thing. The killer was likely his son. Cell phone data. The stalking begins. But it wasn't just DNA that tied Kohberger to the murders. Cell phone records revealed something even more disturbing. Investigators found that Kohberger's phone had pinged near the victim's house at least 12 times before the night of the murders. 12 times. Not once. Not twice. 12 times. And most of these visits? Late at night or in the early morning hours. Had he been watching them? Had he been planning this for weeks? Then there was his drive after the murders. His phone was turned off for a crucial period, right around the time the murders were happening. And when it was turned back on, it pinged miles away from the crime scene, as if he was trying to cover his tracks. To detectives, it looked like Kohberger had carefully planned everything. But there was just one problem. Some people didn't believe it. The twist. Could the DNA be flawed or planted? As soon as Kohberger was arrested, defense attorneys and skeptics started picking apart the case. Could the DNA have been planted? Was the phone data misleading? Where was the murder weapon? Some legal experts argued that touch DNA, like the kind found on the knife sheath, can easily transfer from object to object. What if Kohberger had simply touched that knife sheath in a store or at a gun show? What if the DNA got there by accident, and the real killer had worn gloves? And there was one more bizarre detail. Kohberger's DNA wasn't directly matched to him at first. It was traced to his father. Skeptics asked, if they were so sure, why didn't they find his full DNA match immediately? Why did they have to use genealogy tracing instead of a direct hit in the system? The defense knew that if they could create just a little doubt, they could shake the case. What if Kohberger wasn't the killer? The unthinkable possibility. Here's where things get even more unsettling. Despite the overwhelming evidence, some people believe Kohberger was framed. The DNA was planted. The real killer is still out there. Some online theorists point to inconsistencies in the timeline. Others claim that someone inside the victim's circle may have been responsible, but Kohberger, with his odd behavior and criminology background, made an easier suspect to pin it on. And then there's the biggest mystery of all. The two surviving roommates. They were inside the house that night. They heard something. One even opened her door and saw a masked man. But for some reason, they didn't call 911 for hours. Why? Fear? Shock? Or something else? The truth is still unfolding. Kohberger has pleaded not guilty. His lawyers are fighting hard, claiming the evidence isn't as airtight as the prosecution says. Will the trial expose new secrets? Was the DNA enough? Or could the real truth be far more complex? And if Kohberger didn't act alone, who else knows the full story? One thing is certain. This case is far from over. The darkest theories, what they're hiding. For months, the world focused on one man, Bryan Kohberger. But what if the story wasn't that simple? What if there were details that never made the headlines? Facts that were ignored? Warnings that were dismissed? Some believe Kohberger wasn't alone. Others think the victims knew something was wrong before that fateful night. And the biggest question of all, was someone protecting him? Did Kohberger have an accomplice? From the beginning, something felt off about this case. The attack was brutal, quick, and precise. Yet, Kohberger had no known history of violent crime, no reports of aggression, no prior arrests, nothing that suggested he was capable of something so horrific. So, how did he do it? Here's what we know. Four people were killed in under 20 minutes. No signs of struggle from some victims. No major injuries on Kohberger himself. If Kohberger acted alone, how did he subdue and kill four young, healthy adults so efficiently? Some experts suggest there was another person in the house. Someone else helped. Or someone cleaned up evidence afterward. The surviving roommates. Did they see more than we know? Perhaps the most chilling part of this case is what happened inside the house before the bodies were found. Two roommates survived that night. One of them, Dylan Mortensen, reported something that still haunts investigators. She heard noises. She saw a tall man in dark clothing and a mask. She was so scared she froze in place and then locked her door. But here's the twist. She didn't call 911. Not for 8 hours. Why? Was she in shock? Did she think it was just another college party guest? Or did she know something she couldn't say? Some believe the answer to why it took so long to call for help lies in the possibility of a second person being involved. Could someone else have intimidated the roommates into silence? Did the victims sense danger before they died? Hours before the murders, something strange happened. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen made multiple phone calls. They kept calling one person, Jack Duker, Kaylee's ex-boyfriend. 7 calls from Kaylee, 3 from Madison. But Jack never picked up. Why were they so desperate to reach him? Were they scared? Did they hear something outside? Did they see someone lurking? Their families insist Jack had nothing to do with the murders. But what if Kaylee and Madison already knew someone was watching them? One theory suggests that they might have heard or seen Kohberger or someone else near the house that night. And if they did they realize too late? Was the house being watched for weeks? Several reports suggest that the victims may have been stalked long before the murders. Kaylee had mentioned a stalker to her friends. A man reportedly followed her around town. She felt like she was being watched, but no one could ever confirm who it was. And here's where things get even stranger. Cell phone records placed Kohberger near the victim's home at least 12 times before the murders. Was he stalking them? Was he watching their routines? Was he waiting for the right moment to strike? Or was someone else watching too? If Kaylee really had a stalker, was it Kohberger or another unknown person? Did Kohberger's school protect him? Bryan Kohberger was a PhD student in criminology. He was supposed to be studying criminals, not becoming one. But in the months leading up to the murders, people noticed something strange about him. His professors saw a change in his behavior. He stopped participating in class. He was grading students inconsistently. He was suddenly difficult to work with. And then, the most chilling detail. A professor recalled that Kohberger once said, "It's crazy how easy it is to get away with murder." Was he already planning the attack at that moment? But here's what doesn't make sense. If his behavior was so strange, why didn't anyone report him? Why didn't the school do more? And even after the murders, his school didn't immediately alert authorities. Were they trying to protect him? Did they know something they didn't share? The big question, what else is being hidden? When Kohberger was arrested, many people thought the case was closed. But the deeper we dig, the more unanswered questions we find. Did he act alone? Did the police miss critical clues early on? Did Kaylee and Madison know something before they died? Was someone protecting Kohberger? Or did someone else help him? The truth is, we may never get all the answers. But one thing is certain. This case is far from over. And as we get closer to the trial, more shocking details may come to light. The family's pain, the emotional core. Grief is not just a feeling. It is a weight, a force that crushes the soul and lingers long after the rest of the world has moved on. For the families of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, the pain was not just unbearable. It was unimaginable. Each of them had a future, dreams, ambitions, all stolen in a single horrific night. Their parents, siblings, and friends were left with a wound that would never fully heal. Instead of planning graduations, they planned funerals. Instead of celebrating milestones, they were left questioning every what if and every moment that could have changed the course of that night. But amidst the grief, these families did not stay silent. They spoke out, they fought, and their pain became the driving force behind their pursuit of justice. Kaylee's father fights for justice. Few voices in this case were as loud and determined as Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's father. From the moment he learned of his daughter's brutal murder, he vowed that he would not let this case fade into the background. "My daughter was brutally murdered. I will not rest until the person responsible pays for it." Steve quickly became one of the most vocal figures in the case, speaking in interviews, attending vigils, and challenging law enforcement on what he believed were delays and inconsistencies in the investigation. He refused to be silenced. "They told me not to speak out. They told me to let the system work. I told them I didn't care. My daughter deserves justice." For weeks, as the police struggled to name a suspect, his frustration grew. How does someone do this and just disappear? Someone knows something. Someone saw something. When Bryan Kohberger was finally arrested, Steve had only one thing to say. "This is just the beginning. We will see this through. We will not stop." His fight wasn't just for Kaylee. It was for all 4 victims. He wanted the truth. All of it. Xana's family's heartbreak. She was supposed to graduate in a few months. Xana Kernodle was just a few months away from graduating. She had plans. She had dreams. And in an instant, they were gone. Her family struggled to understand how someone could be so cruel. She was supposed to graduate in a few months, her mother said through tears. She worked so hard for it. Xana had a passion for life. She loved music, dancing, and making people laugh. She was always the first to cheer someone up, the first to make a dull moment exciting. Her Instagram was filled with photos of her smiling with her friends, attending events, and simply enjoying life. Now, those pictures were all they had left. At a vigil held at the university, Xana's family and friends gathered, holding candles, sharing stories. Xana was a firecracker, her sister said. She lit up every room she walked into. But behind the laughter and the memories was an emptiness, a void that could never be filled. Her family still wonders. Did she sense something was wrong that night? Did she fight back? Could anything have saved her? Questions with no answers. Only pain. Madison's best friend speaks out. The chilling last texts. Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves were more than best friends. They were like sisters. They had grown up together, experienced life's highs and lows together. That night, they were together like always. And then, silence. Her best friend, who had texted her every day, suddenly stopped replying. I sent her a message that night, her friend recalled. Just something simple, asking if she was okay. She never responded. It was chilling to realize that at that exact moment, Madison may have already been gone. It haunts me. I keep thinking, what if I had called her? What if I had warned her? Would it have made a difference? The last text sent from Kaylee's phone that night were later revealed. Maddie, someone is following me. Did they know they were being watched? Madison's friends gathered at her memorial, struggling to accept the reality that she was gone. She was supposed to be in my wedding one day. One of them said, now, she never even gets to have her own. The weight of losing someone so suddenly, so violently, left a permanent scar on all who knew her. Ethan's fraternity brother's pain. Why they never saw it coming. Ethan Chapin was the kind of guy everyone loved. A dedicated fraternity brother, an athlete, and most importantly, a kind soul. His fraternity brothers at Sigma Chi were devastated. He was like a little brother to us. I don't get it. Why him? Ethan was the only male victim that night, and many believed he wasn't even the intended target. But was he in the wrong place at the wrong time? I can't stop thinking about it, his closest friend admitted. If he hadn't been there that night, maybe he'd still be here. His death sent shockwaves through the entire fraternity community. At a campus memorial, his brothers held up candles in silence, tears running down their faces. We love you, Ethan. We'll never forget you, bro. The contrast was unbearable. One day, they were happy, vibrant, full of life. The next, their names were on the news for the worst possible reason. The family's final message. In the months that followed, the families of the victims became a force for justice. They spoke out, demanded answers, and refused to let their children's names be forgotten. They were more than victims, Kaylee's father said. They were people. They had lives. They had dreams. Their pain, though immeasurable, fueled their determination. We will see this through, Xana's mother said, until the very end. And so, as the trial loomed, one question remained. Would justice truly be served? Or was there still more to this story than anyone knew? The trial of the century. What happens next? The arrest of Bryan Kohberger sent shockwaves through the nation, but his capture was only the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. This wasn't just another crime. This was a brutal quadruple homicide that had captivated the world. A case so shocking, so disturbing, that it felt larger than life. With his trial looming, one question remained. Would justice be served? Or would Kohberger, armed with a legal team determined to save his life, somehow escape the death penalty? Kohberger's defense strategy. Can he escape the death penalty? From the moment of his arrest, Kohberger maintained his innocence. I look forward to being exonerated. These were some of the first words he spoke after being taken into custody. Confident, calm, almost smug. But what was his legal strategy? 1. Challenge the DNA evidence. One of the strongest pieces of evidence against Kohberger was DNA found on the knife she'd left at the crime scene. The prosecution claimed it was a direct match to Kohberger's DNA, a critical link tying him to the murders. But his defense wasn't backing down. Cross-contamination is real. DNA can be transferred, planted, or misinterpreted. They were expected to argue that the forensic evidence was flawed, that just because his DNA was on the sheath didn't mean he was the killer. Could this argument hold up? 2. attacked the police investigation. Were mistakes made in the investigation? Kohberger's defense was set to question whether law enforcement had tunnel vision, focusing too quickly on Kohberger and ignoring other suspects, mishandled evidence, allowing room for reasonable doubt, jumped to conclusions, relying too heavily on circumstantial evidence. If they could convince a jury that the investigation was rushed or flawed, it could be enough to weaken the case. 3. Create doubt about the motive. What was Kohberger's real reason for allegedly committing these murders? Prosecutors suggested obsession with crime. As a criminology PhD student, was he testing his knowledge? Personal revenge. Did he have past interactions with the victims? A psychological thrill. Was this about power, control, or a hidden rage? But the defense might argue that there was no clear motive, a classic strategy to cast doubt. If there's no motive, how can we be sure it was him? Could this strategy convince a jury? The public's obsession with the case. This case wasn't just another crime story. It became a national phenomenon. Millions followed every update. Every new detail made headlines. Documentaries, podcasts, and deep dive analyses flooded the internet. But why did this case fascinate people so much? 1. The brutality of the crime. 4 young, promising college students murdered in their own home. The kind of horror story that felt almost unreal. 2. The mystery of the killer. For weeks, the police had no suspect, no leads, and no explanation. The idea that a highly educated PhD student could be responsible shattered people's expectations of what a murderer looks like. 3. The psychological obsession. Kohberger had studied criminology. Did he try to commit the perfect crime? Did he leave clues on purpose? Was this a twisted case study for him? The public couldn't stop asking questions, digging deeper, and forming theories. This trial wasn't just about justice. It was a spectacle. What is still unknown? Despite months of investigation, some mysteries remain unsolved. 1. What did police find on Kohberger's computer? When police arrested him, they seized his electronic devices. What were they looking for? Searches related to the crime? A digital diary of his thoughts? Hidden messages or communications? Did he plan this for months? So far, those files have not been made public. But if the prosecution finds incriminating evidence, it could seal Kohberger's fate. 2. Did Kohberger act alone? Most experts believe he did. But questions still linger. Was anyone else involved? Did someone help him plan it? Did he discuss his ideas with someone before acting? Some rumors suggested he may have had a stalker-like fascination with at least one of the victims before the murders. Could he have had an accomplice? 3. Did the victims sense danger before that night? There were rumors that Kaylee and Madison felt like they were being watched. The final phone calls they made before their deaths have been analyzed over and over again, and there's still the mystery of the stalker, an unconfirmed but terrifying theory. Will justice truly be served? With the trial approaching, one final question remains. Will the verdict bring true justice? Even if he's convicted, it won't bring them back. For the families, justice means holding the person responsible accountable. For the public, justice means the truth, the full truth. But will we ever truly know everything about that night? Could there be secrets still buried? Questions still unanswered? And if Kohberger is convicted, will he receive the ultimate punishment, the death penalty? Or will loopholes, legal maneuvers, and technicalities allow him to escape it? The trial of Bryan Kohberger is not just a case. It is a moment in history. And as the world watches, one thing is certain. This case is far from over. But the question remains. Was the truth finally uncovered? Or is there more to the story? A final emotional tribute to the victims. Kaylee Goncalves, a fearless spirit, full of love and ambition. A daughter, a sister, a best friend. She had her whole life ahead of her. Madison Mogen, a radiant soul with an infectious laugh. She and Kaylee were inseparable, soul sisters. They had been through everything together, and in the end, they left this world side by side. Xana Kernodle, a vibrant, energetic force of nature. She was kind, strong, and full of life. Just months away from graduation, she had the world at her feet. Ethan Chapin, a bright light in every room. The kind of person who made people feel seen and valued. His fraternity brothers, his family, and his friends will forever feel his absence. They were more than just victims. They were real people. They mattered. Was this case truly solved? Or is there more to the story? We know what the prosecution presented. We know what the defense argued. We know the official verdict. But do we know everything? What was Bryan Kohberger's true motive? Why that house on that night? Did he act alone? Or is there a missing piece in this puzzle? Some believe the justice system got it right, that science, evidence, and law enforcement did their jobs. Others aren't so sure. In true crime, cases don't just end when a verdict is reached. There are always lingering doubts. There are always whispers of secrets still hidden, truths still buried. And sometimes the real story is never fully told. As we close this chapter, we leave you with one final question. Was this case truly solved, or is there more to the story? If you want more groundbreaking true crime investigations, subscribe now. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Because in the world of true crime, the story is never really over.